Getting forced labor from black slaves and treating them like less than humans were not the only things slaves faced. Often, the world ignores the details and the conditions in which black slaves worked. Under the scorching sun, when their masters used to relax in their homes, these black slaves would struggle in plantations, while the heat would burn them. But the story goes beyond that. Some of the worst forms of degradation and punishments were given to these slaves. In this video, we will explain how disturbing the life of a black slave on plantations was. Let's get started. The plantation system, which relied heavily on slave labor, is often depicted as a tool of British colonization, marked by social and political inequalities. This system intertwined agricultural prosperity with the dominance of aristocrats and the brutal exploitation of enslaved individuals. To understand the extent of the cruelty, consider the gruesome practices employed as forms of punishment. Many male slaves endured amputations or castrations, and in the most extreme cases, their male organs were completely cut off. These acts aimed to strip away any trace of male pride and assert the dominance of the white slave owners. What's even more tragic is that the primary targets were often young boys, aged 9 to 12, and many lost their lives due to the excruciating nature of these procedures. African slavery dates back to the 16th century when Spanish and Portuguese colonizers first used African slaves. However, the 18th century Atlantic slave trade marked a significant shift, with the British playing a leading role in this expansive and highly profitable source of labor. Plantations represented a unique economic and social institution, functioning both as farms and factories. The diversified landed estates in Britain, most plantations specialized in a single crop, such as sugarcane, cotton, or tobacco, for export production. These large-scale specialized plantations, typically spanning 80 to 100 hectares or more, outperformed smaller farms. Many plantations even functioned as large corporations, with hired managers overseeing operations on behalf of absentee owners. To maintain their operations and ensure productivity, plantations required a substantial labor force, prompting planters to turn to enslaved Africans. This shift in farming practices in the European colonies of the New World coincided with the conquest of the Americas, resulting in the availability of vast tracts of fertile tropical land that became ideal for plantation agriculture. Sugarcane, a crop in high demand, was initially discovered by settlers in the tropical regions of the Americas. It proved to be a more cost-effective sweetener than alternatives and had the potential to transform the rather bland European diet. As demand for sugar grew, its price decreased with increased cultivation, making it accessible to a broader population. In the 1600s, sugar was considered a luxury for the wealthy, but by the 1800s, it had become a common ingredient in tea for a large portion of the population. However, the process of turning sugarcane into sugar was quite labor-intensive. Planting, maintaining, harvesting, and processing sugarcane, often in harsh and grueling conditions, demanded a significant workforce. The most viable solution was to employ African slaves, which led to the rapid expansion of the African slave trade. The most dramatic surge in sugar production occurred on the largest islands, including Jamaica, Saint Dominique, and Cuba. By 1775, Jamaica alone was responsible for half of Britain's sugar production. While most plantations had 50 or fewer slaves, the larger ones had hundreds who struggled in exhausting shifts, sometimes lasting up to 18 hours a day during harvest season. Life for slaves in the fields meant relentless labor from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, often accompanied by meager and subpar food. Their diet primarily consisted of maize, rice, peanuts, yams, and dried beans. Unfortunately, the quality of this food was often compromised. Additionally, slaves, including children, were strictly prohibited from consuming dairy products, a restriction rooted in the misconception that Africans were highly lactose intolerant. Beyond the daily grind of planting and harvesting, slaves were required to perform a wide range of other labor tasks. They cleared new land, dug ditches, felled and transported wood, and maintained buildings and tools. Many slaves also had specialized roles as mechanics, blacksmiths, drivers, carpenters, and more. Black women faced additional responsibilities, including caring for their families, cooking, tending to children, and engaging in tasks like spinning, weaving, and sewing to provide clothing, as they were often inadequately supplied by their owners. But this is not the entire truth. Slave men and women were beaten, humiliated, and degraded to the lowest levels. However, this is underreported, and more modest accounts are told only. Slaves were regarded as property, and this dehumanizing status was consistently reinforced through acts of actual or threatened violence, coupled with pervasive racial discrimination. Women, in particular, faced the persistent threat and reality of sexual exploitation. There were no safeguards in place to shield them from sexual harassment, stalking, or rape perpetrated by masters and overseers. Many endured the harrowing experience of being used as long-term concubines. This abuse was disturbingly prevalent, as men in positions of authority took advantage of the vulnerable situation these women found themselves in. You should know that the black woman slaves did not have a choice. Often, a questionable argument is presented that if black women slaves were abused, why did they give consent? Well, this argument is flawed in itself, as black women slaves did not have any right to give consent as they were considered property. On the other hand, slave men often found themselves powerless to protect the women they cared about, leaving sexually exploited women assaulted and, at times, pregnant. Shockingly, even the abused women were compelled to reproduce, as slavers demanded a new generation of forced bonded labor on plantations. White masters wielded absolute control over a slave's existence, treating them as mere property. Plantation owners essentially acted as dictators, as slaves had no rights. Those who dared to disobey or express objections, even in minor ways, faced severe punishment or were sold at auction. To understand how easy it was to beat or kill slaves, you should know that until 1723, killing a slave was not even considered a felony, and little interest existed in prosecuting the mistreatment of these individuals due to its widespread nature. The methods of punishment were horrifyingly brutal and included whipping, shackling, hanging, burning, mutilation, branding, rape, and incarceration. The severity of these punishments varied, with even pregnant women not spared from such cruelties. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Runaway slaves who were captured faced hanging or mutilation, and they were frequently whipped for even minor transgressions. The number of lashes inflicted depended on the perceived gravity of their offense. Some slaves were fitted with metal collars which were thick and heavy, often equipped with spikes that hindered work. In some cases, disobedient slaves were at times subjected to the gruesome practice of being boiled to death in hot sugar syrup. Olaudah Equiano, a former black slave who published his life story in 1789, recounted horrifying incidents, such as witnessing a fellow enslaved person being beaten until bones broke, merely for letting a pot boil over. Moreover, slaves were punished not only for physical failures, but also for perceived violations of symbolic social order, reflecting the pervasive dehumanization they endured. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, an estimated 10 to 12 million black people were forcibly transported from Africa to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. These unfortunate souls were torn from their homes, bought and sold as commodities by fellow human beings, and crammed into overcrowded slave ships, where they endured treatment worse than that afforded to animals. Their harrowing journey across the Atlantic, lasting anywhere from 21 to 90 days, subjected them to unimaginably horrific conditions. Separated from their families and forced aboard these ships, slaves were stripped of their humanity. They were shackled by ankle irons, branded with hot irons, and relegated below deck, where they were crammed side by side in slave decks, often with ceilings just a few feet high. The conditions were horrendously tight and unsanitary, resulting in suffocation, malnutrition, and disease that claimed the lives of many. The crew's torture and murder of slaves were tragically commonplace. The death toll aboard these slave ships was so staggering that the Portuguese grimly referred to them as floating tombs. Upon arriving in the New World, slaves were exchanged for commodities like sugar or tobacco and sold to white masters who would force them into grueling labor on their plantations. From sunrise to sundown, Slaves worked relentlessly in the fields beneath the scorching southern sun. At first light, they were out plowing, hoeing, or harvesting cotton, depending on the season. They were not allowed to stop until noon, when they received a brief 10 to 15-minute break. Then, it was back to their grueling labor, and any slacking would result in punishment, typically a whipping. They worked tirelessly until darkness obscured their vision and didn't dare pause, not even for dinner, until the overseer declared their day's work complete. Even after dark, their work wasn't finished. They still had chores like chopping wood and tending to animals. It's sad to know that slaves worked over 20 hours a day, receiving only 4 hours of sleep. Hence, the accounts reporting that black slaves were allowed to rest, interact with each other, and pray are rejected here. They worked by candlelight, and when they finally retired to bed, it was only for a short rest before beginning the relentless cycle anew the next day. This unending labor left no time for relaxation. This harsh labor spared no one, regardless of age or physical condition. Strong slaves worked in the fields, while the elderly and disabled were assigned tasks such as spinning cotton, weaving cloth, and making clothes for hours on end. Former slave Solomon Northup recounted his first-hand experiences in his book, 12 Years a Slave, stating, "The day's work over in the field, the baskets are carried to the gin house. No matter how fatigued and weary he may be, no matter how much he longs for sleep and rest, a slave never approaches the gin house with his basket of cotton, but with fear. If it falls short in weight, and if he has not performed the full task assigned to him, he knows that he must suffer. And if he has exceeded it by 10 or 20 pounds, in all probability, his master will measure the next day's task accordingly. So whether he has too little or too much, his approach to the gin house is always with fear and trembling. Most frequently, they have too little, and therefore it is that they are not anxious to leave the field after weighing, following the whippings." The master employed an overseer whose primary role was to closely monitor the slaves, ensuring they worked to their utmost capacity, and punishing them when they failed to meet expectations. Literally, they were the dictators, and whatever they said should be followed. Every move and every breath should be breathed as the overseer ordered. Slaves worked under the constant threat of the overseer's whip. Failure to pick the required amount of cotton or any perceived slackness during the day resulted in brutal whippings. This pervasive fear was an integral part of their daily existence. The floggings were excruciatingly painful, leaving deep, crisscrossing gashes on their backs. Flogging was not the sole method of punishment. Other forms of cruelty were employed. Some slaves were placed in shackles, while others were hanged and left to die. Mutilation, such as the removal of ears or gouging out of eyes, was not uncommon even in the cotton plantations. Additionally, branding with hot irons was used to mark and control slaves. A legal system known as the slave codes dictated every aspect of a slave's life, outlining what masters could and couldn't do to them. However, there was no limit to the punishments the masters could give to the slaves. Slaves possessed no rights whatsoever, and masters exercised nearly unrestrained authority over them. In 1831, a black preacher named Nat Turner led the only sustained slave revolt in American history. However, the revolt was brutally crushed by the state militia. The captured rebels were tried and executed, and many innocent slaves were interrogated and killed. Some endured horrific torture, including having their feet held on fire. One slave nearly had his foot burned off before it was discovered that he was innocent. Turner managed to evade capture for 2 months, but was eventually apprehended, tried, and hanged. Nat Turner's revolt instilled fear among whites and triggered a new wave of legislation that further suppressed black religious practices, limited the rights of free blacks, and imposed further restrictions on the movement, education, and assembly of slaves. As for the living conditions, slaves were forced to live in small huts or sheds constructed from rough logs or boards. Sadly, these were the same sheds where animals lived, showing what the slave masters considered slaves. These dwellings lacked floors, and the black slaves slept on bar dirt. Few windows allowed for natural light, and furnishings were non-existent. Often, 2 families shared a single hut, resulting in cramped quarters devoid of privacy or dignity. Men and women often slept together on the floor on collections of old rags and straw strewn in corners. They possessed only one coarse blanket for warmth. Many huts were poorly constructed, allowing rain and snow to penetrate through the cracks, turning the dirt floors into mud. These huts were the place where slaves slept for 4 hours and gave birth. Slaves rose early and retired late, often staying up late at night to mend clothing or prepare meals for the following day. Oversleeping in the morning often resulted in whippings. As for the domestic slaves, they lived in the homes of their masters and mistresses. These house slaves were regarded as privileged within the slave population. Instead of working in the fields, they performed household chores like cooking, gardening, running errands, sewing, and repairing clothes for the master's family. They also tended to domestic animals and carried out various household tasks, including caring for the master's children. Did you know these things were done with black slaves on plantations, whether they were men, women, or children? Isn't it heart-wrenching that they did not get an iota of yield from the plantations as everything went to the masters? Let us know what you think about how black slaves spent their lives on plantations. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.